So my priorities as a new chair will be to have the platform work as efficiently as possible. We have some amazing assessments coming out over the next few years, so making it sure that these are as strong and as impactful as they can be. And then also to make sure that biodiversity and climate change are working together in full alignment, because they're both facing global crises and those crises need to be dealt with together. And then of course interacting with other science policy interfaces as well. I've come from the Nexus assessment myself, and so I see everything as being interconnected. So I've just come from the Climate COP, and I was involved in several sessions with the IPCC as IPBES. So it's great to be working together with them and moving towards alignment. Now I think in the climate space there's full acknowledgement now that nature is critical to addressing the climate crisis. But what we need to have is the full inclusion and integration of the nature community or biodiversity community, such as IPBES and others, with the climate community to plan for this integration, because there are many sensitivities, many particularities about how biodiversity is affected by climate change, how it can help resolve climate change, but it's very complicated, and we need to have full involvement and discussion down to local levels and involving the stakeholders and stewards of nature on the ground, indigenous people and local communities, and our biodiversity community as well. So the scientific communities for climate and biodiversity already interact together. We share authors across both platforms in the climate and the biodiversity reports that we do. We've had a joint workshop report that came out a few years ago that really laid out the space in the middle of what we need to address. And what we'd like to do is to ensure that the coming reports that we each do are increasingly inclusive of the other communities, and that we can perhaps plan some of these reports and outputs together, and that we become increasingly integrative of other domains of science, natural science and social science, and experience on the ground that are necessary to make sure that the science policy outputs that we produce are fully relevant to making decisions from local to global levels. So what we're trying to do with the Nexus assessment is to provide options that decision makers can consider in deciding on how they implement their business. So we're looking at 5 main sectors, so biodiversity and climate, of course, but then also food systems, health and water as well. So for example, if you're an actor in the food sector of business and you're trying to decide on your value chain, where you get your commodities from, how you process them and the transport, is that typically decision makers consider their own interests, but we want people to consider the trade-offs and the synergies that they can also have with the other sectors. So you can make choices that are good for actors in other elements of the nexus or other fields, rather than having negative impacts on them. So in the transformative change assessment, what we're trying to do is to make it more tangible for people, decision makers and government, or also companies and others, what transformative change means and how to actually approach it. Because we've been calling in global assessments and other global reports, and the IPCC does it as well, for transformative change. And this means making decisions that are better for oneself, but also for the environment, for biodiversity, for climate, and for others in society too. People use the word or the term positive tipping points as well. So how do we make decisions that really tip the balance towards better outcomes in the future rather than worse outcomes? And that's what we're hoping transformative change will help explain. So I do hope this is an important African moment for the science policy interfaces and for addressing climate change and biodiversity together. because Africa is one of the continents that is most dependent on biodiversity, has a lot of intact biodiversity remaining, but is very vulnerable to climate change as well. And we need to find integrated solutions that work for us on the continent, as well as working for the global community in understanding how we deal with these global crises jointly. Well, stakeholders are critically important for IPBES. We talk about ourselves as a science policy interface, but really it's science policy society. And that inclusion of society, of people, businesses, communities, representatives of major groups in generating the science that we produce, and then in considering options for making decisions about what to do afterwards with that science. The involvement of stakeholders is critically important. So we engage a lot with stakeholders. We have our stakeholder days to really maximize those inputs, and then also hopefully maximize the return and the use of our products once they're out. Well, I think my main message to the entire IPBES community is really the critical role of nature in our lives and in society. We have it in our name, biodiversity and ecosystem services, and without natural systems, without those ecosystem services, quality of life is just terrible. In fact, we wouldn't really be alive on the planet. So this is a critical decade for ensuring sustainability of natural systems and what we can get from them. And so I think we really need to make this work, and this is a very exciting time to be in IPBES and to contribute what we can to the global community.